One stormy night in Atlanta, Elijah Carter, a successful black businessman, finds himself in the crosshairs of a corrupt cop. Accused of a crime he didn't commit, he finds himself in a rigged trial where a racist judge decides his fate. And who is this powerful man? Why did he decide to help Elijah Carter? Watch the truth come to light, and these powerful figures face the consequences of their greed on H2 Black Thread. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. This story is just beginning.
The rain came down in heavy sheets, drumming against the windshield of Elijah Carter's sleek black BMW as he drove down the quiet backroads of Atlanta, Georgia. The streetlights flickered sporadically, their hazy glow distorted by the downpour. The rhythmic swishing of the windshield wipers kept time with the faint jazz playing on the radio, a soothing contrast to the storm outside. Elijah had just wrapped up a long business dinner at a high-end restaurant in downtown Atlanta, securing a new investment deal that would push his company's expansion forward. As the CEO of Carter Global Enterprises, a multi-million-dollar firm specializing in real estate and urban development, he was no stranger to late-night drives home. Tonight should have been like any other, just another ride home. But fate had other plans. As Elijah turned onto a quieter stretch of road, the flashing glow of red and blue lights filled his rearview mirror. His heart sank. Not again. The sight was familiar. Too familiar. Being a black man in America, especially one who had built success for himself, meant that police stops were an unfortunate and regular part of life. He had been pulled over more times than he could count, always for the same tired excuses: random check, suspicious behavior, or matching a vague description. Keeping his composure, Elijah took a deep breath and pulled over to the side of the road. He moved carefully, already knowing the routine by heart, both hands on the steering wheel. Window rolled down halfway, wallet and registration in clear sight on the dashboard. He watched in the side mirror as a tall, broad-shouldered officer stepped out of the squad car, his movements slow and deliberate. The rain poured down, but the man didn't seem to mind. He moved with an air of authority, no superiority. Officer Jake Dawson. Elijah recognized him instantly. Everyone in the black community of Atlanta knew Jake Dawson. His reputation was whispered in barbershops, in churches, in community meetings. Stories of his unjustified stops, excessive force, and habitual harassment of black men were more than rumors. They were facts, backed by the bruises and court cases that never made it past a corrupt system. This was not a routine stop. This was a hunt. Dawson approached the driver's side, tapping his flashlight against the window like a predator toying with its prey. His sharp blue eyes studied Elijah, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips as if he had already decided how this encounter would go. "License and registration," he barked, his voice rough and impatient. Elijah nodded, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. He handed over the documents, his fingers steady despite the tension creeping up his spine. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his voice even and calm. Dawson barely glanced at the license before shifting his weight. "Your car matches the description of a stolen vehicle reported in this area." Elijah frowned but kept his face neutral. "That's impossible. I've had this car for years, registered in my name." Dawson tilted his head as if considering Elijah's words, then clicked his tongue. "Step out of the vehicle." Elijah's jaw clenched. He knew where this was going. "I'd prefer to stay inside. I've done nothing wrong." Dawson's smirk widened and he placed a hand on his holster. A silent warning. "Now," he ordered. Elijah exhaled slowly. He didn't want this to escalate, but it already had the moment Dawson decided to stop him. As soon as Elijah stepped out into the cold rain, Dawson moved fast. He grabbed Elijah's wrist and yanked him forward, forcing him against the side of the BMW. Hands on the hood. Elijah felt the cold metal press against his palms as Dawson patted him down roughly. "This is unnecessary," Elijah muttered. Dawson ignored him. Instead, he pulled open the passenger side door and leaned inside, rummaging through the glove compartment under the seats. Then, like magic, he found something. Dawson stepped back, holding up a shiny Rolex watch. "Well, well," Dawson sneered. "Look what we have here. Stolen property." Elijah's stomach dropped. He had never seen that watch before in his life. "That's not mine." His voice was controlled, but there was a dangerous edge to it now. Dawson feigned mock disappointment. "Oh, because we had a report of a stolen Rolex earlier today, and look at this, matches the exact description." Elijah knew he was being set up. He could see it in Dawson's eyes, the twisted pleasure in framing him for something he hadn't done. Before he could say another word, Dawson spun him around and slammed him onto the hood of the car. Pain shot through Elijah's ribs as cold metal cuffs clamped around his wrists. "This is bullshit," Elijah gritted his teeth. Dawson leaned down, his voice a whisper that only Elijah could hear. "You people never learn, do you?" he muttered. Elijah felt rage coil inside him like a tightly wound spring, but he forced himself to remain calm. Reacting violently would only give Dawson more power. "This won't end the way you think," Elijah said, his voice quiet but firm. Dawson chuckled. "You're right. It'll end with you in prison where you belong." He shoved Elijah into the back of the police cruiser, the door slamming shut with finality. As the car pulled away, the flashing lights reflecting off the wet pavement, Dawson had no idea that he had just arrested the wrong man. Elijah sat still in the back of the police car, his mind already working. He wasn't just a businessman. He wasn't just a man in a nice car. He was Elijah Carter, son of Senator Marcus Carter, a man with enough power to tear down an entire police department. Dawson had no idea what he had just done. Elijah smirked to himself as the rain continued to pound against the windows. This wasn't over. Not even close. Elijah Carter barely had time to catch his breath before he found himself in the Fulton County Courthouse less than 48 hours after his arrest. The speed at which he was being processed was alarming, but not surprising. He had seen cases where innocent black men sat in jail for months before ever getting a court date, but here he was rushed through the system like an assembly line product. This wasn't about justice. This was about control. As he was escorted through the courthouse hallways, still in his orange jumpsuit, Elijah noticed the way the guards eyed him. Some with pity, some with amusement. None of them saw him as a man. They saw him as just another statistic. He kept his posture straight, his expression unreadable. They wouldn't break him. Inside the courtroom, he was met with the cold stare of Judge Richard Vaughn, a man who had built his entire career on maintaining a system of oppression. Vaughn was well known in Atlanta's black community, not for justice, but for destruction. His rulings always favored law enforcement, even when the evidence said otherwise. Too many men had lost their freedom in his courtroom. And now, it was Elijah's turn. As Elijah sat down at the defendant's table, his lawyer, Danielle Brooks, leaned over and whispered, "Stay calm. This is bigger than you think. They want to bury you." Danielle had a sharp mind and a fighter's spirit. She had been defending innocent men in cases like this for years, but this was different. The entire case against Elijah felt too clean, too organized, like a machine designed specifically to take him down. Across the room, the prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Kevin Monroe, flipped through his file with a smug expression. Monroe had made a name for himself by aggressively pushing for maximum sentences, especially in cases involving black defendants. When Judge Vaughn entered the courtroom, the air shifted. It wasn't respect Elijah felt from the people in the room, it was fear. Vaughn sat down, adjusting his robes, then turned his piercing gaze to Elijah. "Let's make this quick," he said. The trial began with Officer Jake Dawson taking the stand. He sat confidently, adjusting his uniform like he was about to receive an award. "Elijah Carter was found in possession of stolen property," Dawson declared, his voice filled with false authority. "The Rolex was in plain sight, right there on the passenger seat. When I confronted him about it, he got aggressive." Danielle immediately objected. "Your Honor, there is no proof the watch belonged to my client. No fingerprints, no witnesses placing him at the scene of any alleged theft." Vaughn sighed dramatically, rubbing his forehead as if Danielle's words were an inconvenience. "Overruled." Danielle's jaw tightened. She knew this was coming. The prosecutor, Monroe, smirked before continuing. "This isn't the first time, Your Honor," Monroe said smoothly. "Carter has a history of suspicious behavior. He just hasn't been caught until now." Danielle shot up from her chair. "That is a blatant lie. My client has no criminal record whatsoever." Vaughn didn't even look at her. "Sit down, Miss Brooks." Elijah clenched his fists beneath the table. This wasn't a trial. It was an execution. Danielle did everything in her power to dismantle the prosecution's case. She presented evidence that Elijah had been at a business dinner during the alleged theft. She pointed out that the body cam footage from Dawson's patrol car mysteriously had gaps in the recording. None of it mattered. Judge Vaughn dismissed every argument, every shred of evidence without hesitation. When Danielle requested the Rolex be examined for prints, Vaughn waved a hand. "There's no need for that. Officer Dawson's word is sufficient." Elijah stared at Vaughn, his mind racing. This man wasn't just biased, he was complicit. Dawson and Vaughn weren't just working together on this case. They had likely done this before, sending innocent black men away while lining their own pockets. Danielle slammed her hands on the table. "Your Honor, this is a violation of my client's rights. You are ignoring crucial evidence." Vaughn glared at her, his voice filled with contempt. "You will not tell me how to run my courtroom, Miss Brooks." She exhaled sharply and sat back down, shaking her head. The verdict was already decided before the trial even began. Judge Vaughn turned his gaze back to Elijah. "Mr. Carter, you have been found guilty of grand theft and resisting arrest." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Vaughn barely waited before delivering the sentence. 7 years in prison. Danielle's hands balled into fists. "This is outrageous. My client is innocent." Vaughn ignored her. He banged the gavel. "Court is adjourned." The guards approached Elijah, grabbing his arms to escort him out of the courtroom. But instead of looking defeated, he smiled. A slow, knowing smirk curled on his lips as he locked eyes with Vaughn. The judge shifted uncomfortably. Dawson, standing in the back of the courtroom, frowned. Elijah tilted his head slightly, his voice calm but cutting. "You picked the wrong man." A flicker of doubt crossed Vaughn's face. For the first time he looked nervous. Dawson clenched his jaw, his fingers twitching at his side. Danielle leaned toward Elijah as they led him away. "What are you thinking?" she whispered. Elijah's smirk widened. "Make the call." And just like that, the battle was no longer just about his freedom. It was about burning the entire system to the ground. The air in the Fulton County Detention Center was thick with tension, a mixture of sweat, stale air, and the distant echoes of prisoners shouting in their cells. But as Elijah Carter sat on the hard, metal cot of his temporary holding cell, he didn't feel like a prisoner. He felt like a man waiting for his moment. The call had been made. Somewhere beyond these cold concrete walls, his father, Senator Marcus Carter, was already moving the chess pieces into place. The men who thought they could bury Elijah under a pile of false charges were about to learn something very important. They had picked the wrong man. Elijah smirked to himself, closing his eyes. By the time the sun rose, the world would know the truth. By morning, the news cycle had erupted like a volcano. At first, it was a local Atlanta news station that broke the story. A well-dressed anchor sat behind a polished desk, flipping through her notes, her expression unreadable. In a shocking development, Elijah Carter, son of U.S. Senator Marcus Carter, has been arrested under questionable circumstances. Was his arrest justified, or is this yet another example of racial profiling? The trial was unusually rushed, with no physical evidence linking Carter to the alleged crime. Then came the bigger networks. CNN breaking news, Senator's son arrested, Atlanta police under scrutiny. MSNBC, is this another case of police corruption? Fox News, officer under investigation after arresting high-profile businessman. And on social media, it was an explosion of fury. Justice for Elijah Carter, corrupt cops must go. Dawson is dirty. Thousands of people began sharing their own encounters with Officer Jake Dawson. One woman posted, "Dawson pulled my son over last year. Planted drugs in his car. We fought in court for months, but no one believed us. He's still in prison. How many others have suffered like this?" Another man tweeted, "I was arrested by Dawson 2 years ago. He lied in his report, said I resisted. I had a broken rib and a concussion when I left that precinct." This was no longer just Elijah's case. It was a movement. The tension was palpable when Senator Marcus Carter stepped in front of the press corps in Washington, D.C. Cameras clicked furiously as he adjusted his tie, his normally composed expression replaced by something colder, sharper. "My son has been wrongfully arrested," his deep voice boomed through the microphones, "but this is bigger than just him." He paused, scanning the sea of reporters. "This is about every innocent black man who has been falsely accused, brutalized, and railroaded by a corrupt system. This is about a racist judge, a dirty cop, and a city that has ignored injustice for far too long." A hushed silence followed. Then chaos. Reporters shouted over each other, cameras flashed, news outlets scrambled to adjust their breaking headlines. And then, just as the nation absorbed the weight of his words, the Department of Justice announced they were opening a federal investigation into the Atlanta Police Department. By midnight, the FBI was on the move. A convoy of black SUVs rolled up to the Atlanta Police Department headquarters in the dead of night. The flashing red and blue emergency lights weren't from local law enforcement this time. They were from federal agents. Inside the precinct, chaos erupted. Officers scrambled, some trying to delete files, some grabbing phones to make frantic calls. Others just sat in stunned silence, watching as men in FBI jackets stormed in, barking orders, flashing warrants. "Step away from your desks. Hands where we can see them." Computers were seized. Files were ripped from cabinets. Bodycam footage was retrieved, and what they found was worse than anyone expected. It wasn't just Elijah's case. It was a pattern, a system. A machine designed to keep innocent black men behind bars. One file, then 10, then hundreds. Some had forged signatures. Some had identical charges but different names. One officer whispered to another, "This goes all the way up." And they were right. But before the FBI could take down the king, they had to deal with one of his knights first. Across town, Jake Dawson sat in his darkened apartment, a bottle of whiskey clutched in his shaking hands. The blinds were drawn tight. His badge sat discarded on the table. The television flickered, his own name plastered across the screen. Officer Jake Dawson under investigation for corruption. New evidence suggests pattern of wrongful arrests. FBI raids Atlanta PD. His heart pounded. He had been careful for years, planting evidence, falsifying reports, making sure his tracks were covered. But he never saw this coming. Then came the knock at the door. Thud, thud, thud. His breath hitched. He knew who it was. He stumbled toward his desk, papers burning in the trash can, an old habit from years of covering his tracks. But it was too late. Boom. The door burst open. FBI, hands in the air, Dawson froze, his arms trembling as he slowly raised them. A pair of cold steel handcuffs snapped around his wrists. As they dragged him toward the door, his panic spilled over into desperation. Wait, I was just following orders. I'm not the only one. There are others, Vaughn, the Da, even the governor. The FBI agents exchanged glances. Dawson was talking, and that meant this was far from over. Back at the courthouse, Judge Richard Vaughn sat in his office, watching the news unfold with a growing sense of dread. Dawson was in custody. That was a problem. The officer had too much dirt on too many powerful people. If he cut a deal, and he would, then Vaughn's name would be next. His hands shook as he reached for his phone, dialing a private number. The line rang. Once, twice, then someone answered. "We have a problem," Vaughn muttered. Silence. Then a voice, low, controlled. "You're on your own." The call disconnected. Vaughn sat frozen, his worst fear settling in. No one was coming to save him, not the mayor, not the district attorney, not even the governor. The ship was sinking, and Elijah Carter was the man who set it on fire. The fall of Officer Jake Dawson was only the beginning. His arrest had triggered a massive chain reaction, exposing the deep-seated corruption that had infected the Atlanta Police Department, the court system, and even the governor's office. The entire city was watching, and the dominoes were falling faster than anyone had expected. For years, Judge Richard Vaughn and Officer Jake Dawson had operated with impunity, framing innocent people, accepting bribes, and manipulating the system for their own benefit. But now, their secrets were spilling into the light. By the time the FBI had raided the Atlanta PD, they weren't just looking at Dawson. They were pulling apart an entire network of corruption. A special task force was assembled, poring over thousands of documents, financial records, and police reports. They were looking for patterns, evidence that proved what everyone had suspected but never had the power to expose. And the deeper they dug, the worse it got. Judge Vaughn had sentenced over 500 men to prison under questionable circumstances. Half of the Atlanta Police Department had records of excessive force, wrongful arrests, or false testimonies. The governor's office had received millions in unexplained funds, bribe money meant to keep investigations buried. Hundreds of men had lost years, decades, of their lives because of these criminals in power. Families destroyed, futures stolen, and all for what? Greed, racism, power. The media had a field day with the scandal. Breaking: FBI investigation into Atlanta PD reveals systematic corruption. Hundreds of cases under review, wrongfully convicted inmates may be freed. Governor Robert Hastings tied to bribery scheme, federal charges possible. The city was in an uproar. Protests erupted in front of the courthouse, outside the police precinct, even at the governor's mansion. And then, the FBI dropped the hammer. A week after Dawson's arrest, the U.S. Attorney for Georgia stepped in front of the cameras, flanked by FBI officials. The press conference was aired nationwide. The room fell silent as the attorney cleared his throat and began. Over the past several weeks, our federal investigation into corruption within the Atlanta Police Department has revealed extensive misconduct, ranging from wrongful convictions to the systematic planting of false evidence. These actions, carried out under the leadership of Judge Richard Vaughn and Officer Jake Dawson, have resulted in the unjust incarceration of hundreds of innocent individuals. The room erupted in gasps, but he wasn't finished. Furthermore, we have uncovered financial transactions directly linking Governor Robert Hastings to this corruption network. We have substantial evidence that he received bribes to cover up internal investigations and to ensure that police misconduct went unpunished. A bomb had just been dropped on Georgia politics. The governor of Georgia was now under federal investigation. The press exploded with questions. Is the governor being arrested? How long has this corruption been going on? Will the wrongfully convicted be freed? And just like that, the city was never the same again. Inside the governor's mansion, Robert Hastings sat in his dimly lit office, watching his empire collapse in real time. His closest aides refused to take his calls. His donors were pulling their support, and worst of all, his own legal team was telling him to take a deal. Hastings clenched his jaw. He had spent years hiding the truth, making sure that the corruption never touched him, but now, there was no escaping it. Less than 24 hours after the press conference, Hastings stepped up to a podium in front of the Capitol building. His face was ashen, his voice strained. Effective immediately, I am resigning as governor of Georgia. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The once untouchable governor was now a disgraced politician, stripped of power, soon to be stripped of his freedom. And justice wasn't done yet. Inside Fulton County Courthouse, Judge Richard Vaughn sat at his bench for what he thought would be another day of business as usual. He had sentenced hundreds of men in this very chair. Men who had begged for their lives, pleaded for justice, and he had ignored them all. But today, justice was coming for him. The double doors burst open. U.S. Marshals stormed inside. The entire courtroom fell into stunned silence. Richard Vaughn, you are under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, bribery, and abuse of power. The cameras flashed wildly, capturing every moment as Vaughn's face turned ghostly white. His hands trembled as they snapped the cold handcuffs around his wrists. For the first time in his life, Vaughn was powerless. And as he was being led away, he saw a familiar face in the back of the courtroom. Elijah Carter. Their eyes met, a final confrontation. Vaughn's lip curled in a snarl. You ruined me. Elijah took a slow step forward, his expression calm, unreadable. Then he smiled. No. His voice was steady. You did that to yourself. And with that, Judge Richard Vaughn was dragged away, forever. A few days later, Jake Dawson stood in an orange jumpsuit, shackled in the same courtroom where he had once falsely testified against innocent men. His own sentencing was swift. Due to the overwhelming evidence against you, Officer Dawson, you are hereby sentenced to life in federal prison, without the possibility of parole. A sharp gasp echoed through the room. Dawson's face drained of color. The same man who had tormented the innocent was now going to rot in a prison cell for the rest of his life. Elijah didn't attend the sentencing. He didn't need to, because he had work to do. With Vaughn behind bars, Dawson sentenced, and the governor stripped of power, change was finally coming to Atlanta. Hundreds of wrongfully convicted men were having their cases reopened. Families were reuniting, and Elijah Carter, he was just getting started. As he sat in his office, reviewing another case of a wrongfully convicted black man, his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He answered. A woman's voice came through the line. Mr. Carter, we have another one. A man just like you, framed for a crime he didn't commit. Elijah closed his eyes, took a deep breath. Then he stood up. Send me everything. Because the fight wasn't over. Not yet. Elijah Carter stepped out of Fulton County Courthouse, blinking against the harsh glare of the midday sun. The air was thick with the sounds of protesters chanting, the flashing lights of news cameras, and the shouts of journalists desperate to get a statement. For the first time in months, he was a free man. But it didn't feel like a victory. He could hear them, The wrongfully convicted men still behind bars, the families who had spent years fighting for justice and getting nothing in return. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. A reporter broke through the chaos, shoving a microphone toward him. "Mr. Carter, how does it feel to finally be exonerated?" Elijah exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. Did they really think this was the end of his story? He glanced toward the crowd, seeing signs held high: "Justice for the innocent. Dismantle the system. No more wrongful convictions." And then he saw them, the families. A woman clutching a framed photo of her son still locked away. An elderly father, his hands shaking as he held a sign with his wrongfully convicted brother's name. Elijah met their gazes. This wasn't just about him. It never had been. Finally, he turned back to the cameras and spoke. "This is not justice. This is just one step. I walked free today, but there are hundreds, thousands who haven't. And I won't stop until every last one of them has the same chance I did." The crowd erupted, and Elijah Carter walked away not as a man who had been freed, but as a man who was just getting started. Within weeks, Elijah had built a team: attorneys, investigators, journalists, activists, people who had seen the system fail too many times and were ready to do something about it. Together, they launched the Carter Foundation for Justice, a nonprofit dedicated to fighting wrongful convictions, exposing corruption, and reforming the legal system. Reinvestigate wrongful convictions and push for exonerations. Provide legal aid for families who couldn't afford representation. Push for policy reforms to hold corrupt cops, judges, and prosecutors accountable. Create a national database tracking police misconduct and wrongful convictions. And their first case: a 57-year-old black man sentenced to life without parole for a murder he didn't commit 30 years ago. Elijah personally met with the man's daughter, now a grown woman. Tears streamed down her face as she held a faded photo of her father. "They took him when I was 3. I don't even remember him. Please, Mr. Carter, help me bring him home." Elijah swallowed hard. He reached out, squeezing her hand. "I promise you, we'll get him out." And just like that, his war against the system truly began. It was past midnight when Elijah found himself alone in his new office, surrounded by stacks of case files, reports, and evidence records. The walls were covered with photos of the wrongfully convicted, faces that had been forgotten by the world. Each file was another story of injustice. Each name was another life stolen. Elijah rubbed his temples, exhaustion pulling at him. But he couldn't stop. Not now, not ever. Just as he was about to shut his laptop, his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. A woman's voice, urgent, desperate. "Mr. Carter, we have another case. A man just like you. Sentenced to life for a crime he didn't commit." Elijah closed his eyes and took a slow, deep breath. The cycle was repeating itself. But this time he was ready. He opened his laptop again. "Send me everything." The woman let out a shaky breath of relief before hanging up. Elijah stood, grabbed his coat, and turned toward the door. As he stepped into the night, he whispered under his breath, "They picked the wrong man. Again." Elijah Carter wasn't just a survivor. He was a warrior. And as long as innocent men sat in prison, as long as corruption thrived, as long as justice belonged only to the powerful, he wasn't stopping. This wasn't just about one case. This was about a revolution. And Elijah Carter was leading the charge. Elijah Carter's journey is more than just a story of survival. It is a powerful lesson in resilience, justice, and the importance of standing up against corruption. His case exposed a truth that many already knew but were too afraid to challenge. Injustice thrives when people remain silent. For years, Judge Vaughn and Officer Dawson operated without fear of consequences, abusing their power and destroying innocent lives. They relied on a system that protected the corrupt and silenced the oppressed. Elijah's story teaches us that if we do not question authority, if we allow injustice to go unchallenged, the cycle will continue. Speaking out is the first step toward change. Another crucial lesson from Elijah's battle is that corruption often hides behind positions of power. Vaughn was a judge, Dawson was a police officer, and Hastings was the governor, three figures meant to uphold justice, yet they were the ones abusing it. This reminds us that power does not equal righteousness, and titles do not guarantee integrity. We must hold those in authority accountable, because blind trust in a broken system only enables more harm. Elijah's exoneration was not simply a result of truth prevailing. It happened because he refused to accept a corrupt system's judgment. Justice is not something that is given freely. It is something that must be fought for. Had Elijah stayed silent, he would have been another statistic, another innocent man lost in a sea of wrongful convictions. His determination to prove his innocence did not just free him, it ignited a movement. Elijah's fight proves that one person can spark change. What started as one wrongful arrest led to the exposure of an entire network of corruption. His story inspired national outrage, led to multiple arrests, and forced the reopening of hundreds of cases. If he had accepted his fate, none of this would have happened. His journey teaches us that no matter how powerless we may feel, we all have the ability to make a difference. Courage is contagious, and when one person stands up, others will follow. But perhaps the most profound lesson of all is that the fight for justice never truly ends. Even after clearing his own name, Elijah knew that too many others were still trapped in a system designed to keep them there. Instead of walking away, he made it his mission to free them. His foundation now works to expose wrongful convictions, proving that the pursuit of justice is a lifelong commitment. Elijah Carter's story is a reminder to us all: justice is not automatic. Power must always be questioned. One voice can make a difference, and the fight does not stop until justice belongs to everyone. We all have a role to play, whether it is speaking out, supporting those fighting against corruption, or demanding accountability from those in power. The battle isn't over, and it never will be, until the system is fair for all.